Hey there and welcome to DIY Projects with Pete. In today's episode, we're going to walk through the process of building these sliding barn doors in hopes that it gives you some ideas and inspiration for your next DIY project. If you find the video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel, and let's get started. I started by measuring the opening to determine sizing for the double doors. Now for single doors, I typically like to build it 4 inches wider than the opening and about 2 inches taller. And if you have trim and enough space, you can certainly go even wider or taller to cover the trim if you prefer that look. The opening is 34 inches wide, so I marked the center, which is 17 inches in. The doors will meet in the middle and will be about 18.5 inches in width, so each door will overlap a side 1.5 inches. This space doesn't have quite enough room for a normal door or a wide enough sidewall for a pocket door or a single barn door, which is why we chose to go with the double barn door setup. It's going to be great to hide the clutter in the laundry room and to minimize the washer and dryer noise and just look nice. I made a trip to the hardware store to pick up lumber and supplies for the project. I'm using 5/8 inch thick cedar pickets and 23/32 inch thick OSB to build the barn doors. Give the pickets time to dry out if they have a high moisture content to minimize shrinking. The hardware for the barn door all came from Amazon, and I'll have links to that in the description below. I set up my table saw and sawhorses to start building the doors, and you could certainly use a circular saw and a straight edge or a track saw to cut down the plywood if you'd prefer, or if you don't have some sort of an outfeed surface. The setup I'm using today is called a cut hub workstation, and I cut the OSB to form each door on the table saw. Now the factory cut side of the plywood is placed against the fence, and I actually did the first cut an inch wider just in case my cut got off a little bit trying to feed that full sheet of heavy plywood through. So once it was cut to the rough dimension, I ran it through one more time at the exact width of 18 inches and was able to get a very accurate cut. The process was then repeated for the second door. I hadn't decided on an exact height for the door yet, so I cut the OSB a couple inches longer than needed so I could test fit them over the door and figure out the height that would look and work the best. My sliding compound miter saw doesn't quite cut through the full sheet, so I simply flip the sheet to complete the cut. Now if I was doing wider doors, I'd use a circular saw to make this cut, like I did in a similar single barn door project I built about 8 years ago, which is linked to in the description. Use a spacer board on the floor to rest the door on and to simulate the final height you want to go with, and then account for metal edging if you decide to build barn doors similar to mine. I ended up deciding 2 inches taller than the opening would look good and align well with how I want to do the mounting board to give extra support for that railing above the door. A 1x4 board is used to help strengthen where the railing will be mounted for these two small doors. It's sanded smooth before applying a finish, and painting it the same color as the wall will give you a real clean look in my opinion. Once the backerboard is put in place and the railing is installed, it's going to blend right in and hardly be noticeable. I was playing around with the idea to do a backerboard that matched the trim in the basement with the stain color, but I didn't like the look as much and it wasn't as sleek and modern looking. You'll want to use a stud finder to find the framing in your wall so the railing can be mounted securely. Most railing kits are pre-drilled with holes 16 inches on center, so if your studs don't line up perfectly with the pre-drilled holes, you may need to drill additional holes in the railing, add blocking if possible, or potentially use a thicker backerboard. Figure out the approximate height to put the board and attach it to the wall at the studs. We'll use additional hardware later to further secure it. One thing you can do to double check your backerboard and railing placement will work with the height of your door is to attach the rail hardware to a scrap board, cut it the same height as your door, and then just see how it looks. The manufacturer's directions should give you all the instructions on mounting heights, but I've found that sometimes instructions aren't as thorough as they should be, and so you may just want to check to make sure that everything lines up perfectly. The OSB was then cut to its final height on the miter saw. Take a few measurements to check the doors are cut exactly how you want them, and then we'll move on to cutting the pickets. The pickets are cut to the exact same size as the width of the door, and for double doors, you may want to lay out the pickets and find similar grain patterns so when the doors come together, they will either be the same board or a similar pattern, so label the boards if needed, and the ability to use the same board will depend on the width of the doors and length of your pickets. Now matching up everything isn't necessary, and you may prefer some variation, so go with what looks best to you. Lay out the pickets to see if you'll want to trim them to fit the door perfectly. The pickets will vary a bit, but are close to 5.5 inches wide. You can simply trim that last board on the top or bottom to fit, but if you prefer that they are all uniform, divide the total height of the OSB by the number of boards to figure out the size to cut them to. Wood glue or construction adhesive will work well for attaching each picket to the OSB. You will go through quite a bit though, so have plenty on hand. Square up each picket with the OSB and use 1 1/4 inch long 18 gauge nails to attach the pickets. This part goes pretty quickly and it's rewarding since your door is starting to come together. Check the space to make sure the last board will line up properly with the edges of the OSB. Trim on a table saw if needed and then attach. The steps were then repeated on the other door, and one thing I did decide to do to help prevent cupping and to keep the pickets nice and flat was to do a row of nails down the center of each door. Draw a line and then use a brad nailer to put a couple nails through each picket. Then go ahead and flip the doors so the pickets can be attached to the other side. I'd recommend labeling each door so you know which is the left door, right door, front and back side, and top and bottom. I personally like a little variation with the wood grains and the boards used, and I wanted to get the most boards out of each picket without buying extras, so I played around with the layout to get a look that I liked. Now the front side of the door is more uniform than the back because I was able to get 3 boards out of each picket. We live out in the country, and I didn't want to make a trip all the way to town when I ran out of wood glue, so I just used some construction adhesive left over from another project. It's a little thicker than the glue, so I used a notch spreader to apply it thinner. Go ahead and fill the nail holes with wood filler if you'd like. Let it set up and then remove the excess with a damp rag. A sander would work if you'd prefer, but the cedar has quite a bit of texture and some cool saw marks I want to keep, so I don't want to do too much sanding. Measure the sides, top, and bottom of each door to figure out how long to cut the 3/16 inch thick metal flat bar. I used a metal cutoff saw, which makes quick work of cutting the flat bar, but you could use a cutoff wheel on an angle grinder or another method to cut the flat bar. Then use a flap disc on an angle grinder to remove rough edges and burrs. The end pieces are cut to the exact width of the door, and the tall side pieces will overlap those top and bottom end pieces. I'd recommend purchasing the metal flat bar from your local steel provider. It's going to be much cheaper typically than purchasing at a hardware store. I thought I'd show the difference between a clear water-based sealer and an oil-based sealer being applied to the pickets as we were trying to decide which would look best in our basement. The clear sealer will leave the cedar very natural looking with a little sheen, and it won't darken it much. It does go on milky, but it dries clear. And then an oil-based sealer will give it a more amber color and really make the knots pop and give it a rich look. The flat bar will eventually be connected to the sides of the door using screws, so we'll use a drill press and a 3/16 inch bit to create holes in the flat bar. I measured in 1 inch from the side of each short piece and then to the center and drilled a total of 3 holes in each top and bottom piece. And you can use a normal drill, but a drill press is just going to make it easier and a little faster. A total of 7 holes were marked for each of the long pieces and spaced about 12 to 13 inches apart for our 84-inch tall door. The head of the screw will add about 1/8 of an inch thickness outside the flat bar, so I'd recommend staggering the screws for the inner side of the doors where they will butt up against each other in the center so they go together tightly and you don't have a 1/4 inch gap because of the screw heads bumping up against each other. Before painting the flat bar, use a flap disc or a sander to clean up the ends and areas where the holes were drilled. I also like to use alcohol to clean off any grease from the metal. If the weather's decent, I prefer to do the painting outside so the garage doesn't fill with fumes. I'm using a black satin spray paint, and it does dry pretty quickly, which is nice for applying multiple coats, and I'll typically do about 2 to 3 thin coats on each side. Paint the rest of the flat bar pieces, and then take the screws and push them into some cardboard to hold them in place while you give them a couple light coats of paint as well. Moving back to the door, Use 120 grit sandpaper on an orbital sander to sand the sides and even everything out. Next, put a 220 grit pad on the orbital sander and add a slight bevel to the edges. Then sand the top of the pickets to smooth them out and leave as much or as little texture on the boards as you'd like. Before adding a finish, get rid of all the excess sawdust as best as possible. An air compressor or a leaf blower make quick work of this, and then once the doors are back inside, they can be wiped clean with a damp rag. We'll use an oil-based polyurethane by Minwax in the warm, ultra-flat sheen. And this works great for doors, and it's easy to get to look good since it's more of a flat finish. As you can see, it really warms up the look of the doors, and it brings out the character of the knots and the grain. Make sure to keep an eye on any drips that happen on the sides and to brush them smooth before they dry. The next morning, I came out to flip the doors and do a coat on the other side. I let it dry a few hours and then came out again to do a second coat. Here's what it looked like after a second coat had dried. At this point, you can use some high grit sandpaper like 500 grit to lightly sand any bumps if there are any prior to adding the third and final coat of poly. Then apply the final coat, let it dry, and move on to the next step. The screws and metal had plenty of time to dry, so I began attaching the metal around the door. Adding the metal is like putting icing on the cake as it ties everything together and adds a nice contrast. Use a small bit to pre-drill, then attach using the 1 1/4 inch long metal lathe screws. Attach the top and bottom pieces first and work from one end of the metal to the other end. The 3/16 inch flat bar will help ensure the door is straight, and if you need a small clamp to line up the metal with the door, put one on so everything gets lined up perfectly. Then it's just a matter of attaching the remaining sides. Now it's time to install the hardware on the door, and I'm measuring in 2 inches from each side to determine placement for the barn door hardware. Your hardware is going to come with directions to give you recommendations for placement. Bolts will go through the door, so pre-drill with a small bit at each marked hole location for accuracy, and then use a larger bit. When you are purchasing hardware, check to see what thickness of door the bolts and spacers are made for. The bolts they supplied ended up being slightly too short, so instead of going to the store, I just used a router to create a 3/8 inch recessed space on the back side of the door for the bolt head to sit in so the bolt is long enough. Now, if you realize the bolts are too short before the holes are drilled, a Forstner bit is much quicker to use and it's going to create a cleaner hole. As you can see, the bolt now fits through the 2-inch door just fine, and the hardware can be installed securely. Take your time to put on each of the rollers and check to make sure they're lined up square with the door. Then tighten everything in place. The railing hardware I purchased for this small barn door setup is rated to hold 230 pounds, and each door came in close to 75 pounds, giving me a total of 150 pounds, so easily within the rating. There are all sorts of handles to choose from on Amazon, and we chose to use a low-profile recessed handle for our door. They don't include a template for some reason, so I just made one on some scrap paper, and I put the center of the handle 38.5 inches up from the bottom of the door. This particular handle style requires you to use a router or some hand chisels to carve out a recessed area, but there are plenty of handles that simply screw on if you'd prefer. I'm using a router, and make sure to tape around the area to protect the finish so you don't scratch it. Repeat this for each of the doors, and pay extra attention to the orientation of the doors so that the handles are installed in the correct locations. You'll make a bit of a mess with all the sawdust from the router, so grab a shop vac or a broom and a rag to clean everything. The handles can then be installed with the couple of screws provided. The instructions from my kit were to measure up the height of the finished door you just built, plus to add 1 11/16 inches. Make sure to add about 1/8 of an inch to your door height for the screw heads on the bottom of the door, and potentially a little more for the floor track guide hardware if you use a different guide than what's included in the kit. Now, all kits will be different with measurements, so follow the manufacturer's recommendations. A level line should be drawn at your marks, and then line up the rail to use as a template to mark where holes should be drilled. The line marks the center of the railing, and use a small drill bit for accuracy, and then follow up with a larger bit to drill the pilot hole. A lot of the rail kits are 2 pieces, unfortunately, which makes it a bit of a pain to use it as a template for the holes, so my wife helped hold the other side in place while I marked where the rest of the holes needed to be drilled. To further secure the backerboard, I added a screw at each stud location, and then before putting up the rail, use some spackle or wood putty to fill the holes and then give it a fresh coat of paint. Then you can assemble the track, and if you can find a 1-piece track, it's going to be a little easier to install, but this 2-piece works just fine. Install the inside stops on the track, and then I temporarily tightened one of the stops over the center of the track to hold it together while I installed everything. Here's a look at the leg bolt and spacers I used. You can request hardware from the manufacturer of this kit that will work with a 2-inch thick door, which I'd recommend doing since the standard hardware is only meant for doors up to 1 3/4 inches thick. I had to pick up some longer leg bolts at a hardware store and then used a plastic spacer to extend the metal spacer since I didn't know they offered the longer hardware. Continue installing the railing, making sure it has a solid connection and is nice and level. It was time to hang the doors for the first time and to adjust the stops for each door. Once done, the doors came off one more time to install the floor track guide. I purchased this separately from the kit since it's more heavy duty and it easily mounts to the wall, which is ideal if you have a tile floor. Make sure the doors slide smoothly, install the jump pads on top of the door to prevent them from ever lifting off, and then put your new sliding barn doors to use. All right, thanks so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed checking out the process of how these double barn doors were put together. If you did find it helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. And thanks again for watching. Cheers.